So who wants to start the ball rolling? With a question, a suggestion? A remark?
Yes, I have a general question I've been wondering about. All the people that we've had as models and all the people I've ever seen worked on, I've never seen a fat person worked on. What sort of problems do you run into with that?
You just have trouble getting down.
You were here Friday.
Just have trouble getting down here.
See it go into your stomach.
By and by, it lets you through, but it takes you longer and more hard work to get through. When you get a guy that weighs over 200 pounds, you've got a job on your hands. You were here Friday, says he, thinking of his 210, but Peter took that one on. You see, I was already to a place where I could get considerable throughness going. Oh! Our friend Stan Kellerman, speaking of fat men that want work, called up the other day, and he said he would like to talk to me. And I said, well, that's very nice. I would like to talk to him. But until these classes are over, I just didn't have the time. And he said, well, he thought it would be good for him to come into a 5-day workshop. He might learn something. And I said, yes, but the trouble was there were no 5-day workshops. Well, how long were the workshops? 6 weeks. Well, he couldn't see how he could possibly do that. So, you were all informed. And then there was some gal that he wanted to come down to see me. Was she an Alexander person or something?
Gertrude?
Could have been. I don't know. I don't remember what I said. I don't remember whether I said it. Meet me at Esalen that afternoon or what, but at any rate, I don't remember coming. But this is what Kellerman is thinking of. Now, Kellerman is the guy that I do not wish to demonstrate on how you get through fat people. Actually, this guy, Frank, he wasn't too thin, you know.
No.
How much does Kellerman?
I would guess 250 to 275.
He's been losing for the past 6 months, but he's still big.
He's a big Frank man, anyway.
His calves are about like my waist.
Yeah.
That's right. He's one of those enormous people. And Feldenkrais was the last one I really wanted to do. So, follow the recipe.
Stir slower.
Step off the counter.
Get somebody to spread, and then you can work.
Well, the trouble is that top layer won't let you buy.
Oh.
It just won't let you buy. At any rate, let's take a brief look back. And let's see how, for 6 hours, we have been horizontaling the pelvis. And you remember the routine. First hour, the opening of the things that held the pelvis. Second hour, putting a support under it. Lengthening up front. Third hour, you're still lengthening. You're still lengthening. Going deeper with each hour. Getting down in the third hour to the quadratus. In the fourth hour, you're doing a job on the adductors. Again, you're straightening legs, but you're doing much more than that. You're organizing core. Because you see, until you get to that fourth hour adductor organization, until you get there, you have nothing through which to get to the floor of the pelvis, by means of which to get to the floor of the pelvis. And when you get to the fourth hour, you are sort of closing in, edging your way closer and closer to the actual attachments of the floor of the pelvis. And obviously, one has directly affected that floor in that hour. Or it would not have been possible, in the case of these 3 women, which is 100% of the sample we used, to have had that tremendous increase in capacity of the perineum to control itself and to hold. I can't see any other explanation. Incidentally, it should be said here, which is something which I take for granted so many times that I don't bother to talk about it. The fact that many, many times when you have childless couples who are really anxious for a child, they will get one at the end of about a year. It takes a year, apparently, for this thing to organize itself and for that couple to become fecund for some reason. Obviously, this isn't going to happen in 100% of cases, but it does happen in a great many cases. It does, the 4th hour does a very great deal toward making physically intolerable marriages physically tolerable. And so you get a certain peace and quiet going on in these marriages. And they settle down and either are willing to adapt or now they're going to really split. But at any rate, they're no longer sitting on the fence. They're now to the place where they have the data which enables them to make up their mind. This is why they have the physical data. This is about what it's about. And so you see that whole 4th hour is very intimately bound up with the whole problem of sexual adjustment and recognition. And so it becomes an extremely important hour in that sense. But the 5th hour is no less important because by the 5th hour you are beginning to utilize like in all of these hours, you are beginning to utilize what you have made in the 4th hour in terms of balance and in terms of freeing. You are beginning to use this to go up into the body, into the rest of the body, and relieve tension on organs. And you're doing this through the relationship of the recti abdominis, which you see is really a pelvic muscle, which is really concerned with the horizontal organization of the pelvis. But primarily you are doing it by virtue of the fact that you are organizing the psoas. And in your organization of the psoas, you are almost reaching with your hand into the lumbar plexus and affecting the characteristics of the lumbar plexus, the structures which are innervated by the lumbar plexus. So that you see you get into all of that all those abdominal organs. You're also affecting the diaphragm, and through the diaphragm the solar plexus, and through the diaphragm the position of the heart, the behavior of the heart, and the stress on the heart. And so in this 5th hour, you're working your way upward, out of the pelvis, into the structures whose well-being depends upon the positioning of the pelvis. And you see your 4th hour has taken on the positioning of the floor of the pelvis. And the 5th hour begins to turn it up in the front so that it has support under the abdominal organs. And your 6th hour, you are still working with the pelvis and balancing that basin. You are now going in primarily to balance the sacrum with the rest of the pelvis. And just as through the entire series we have never gone where we are working, so here you don't go where you are working, but you go to the areas that influence the sacral position. Now, in order to balance the rotators, one of which is the immediate determinant of sacral position, you have to also give a lot of attention to the hamstrings, and therefore and thereby to the back of the legs, because everything is connected with everything else, and there's no way of escaping this. But by the end of the 6th hour, you see, you have built up from the ground up an organization that should have its 2 feet pretty squarely on the ground, its legs over its feet, its thighs over its legs, its pelvis over its thighs. The lumbar structure coming back so that it is also transmitting its weight down through that pelvis according to the proper design. And so that whole thing, you see, begins to take on a different look and a different aspect. And now you're stable with respect to the bottom. And now you have to do something about getting stable with respect to the top. And the thing to do isn't just to sweep that top under the rug. You can't do it. For one reason you can't do it, because it is too close and too determining of the function of the biggest nerve plexus in the body, the brain. And so now you have to go up and you have to horizontal the head. And then you can put your horizontal head atop your horizontal pelvis and hook the two ends together. Now the head, in addition to being the head, is also so intimately connected with the whole cervical structure, the vertebra, muscles, etc., etc. And some of you here present know, even better than I, the history concerning the fact that there have been schools within the chiropractic, the general chiropractic schools that have been grouped, who claimed that by the proper organization of the atlas, or the atlas on the axis, or some few more of an organization of the cranium on the atlas, that by this you could write anything in the body. Now, I do not go with those people, as is perfectly obvious to you. But the fact remains that there have been an awful lot of them around, and that an awful lot of money has changed hands from people who were satisfied with what they did for them to the practitioner. So obviously what this particular phenomenon is saying is that the positioning of the cervical vertebrae is exceedingly important in determining the well-being of the body. And as you begin to look at the structure, you begin to understand that this is necessarily so. Because just as the position of the vertebra further down the line determine the position and the nutrition and the well-being of the autonomic nervous system down the line, so the position of the cervical vertebrae determine the position of the upper three autonomic plexi, the cervical plexi, superior, inferior, and medial. And what's the name of it? Middle cervical vertebrae. The middle cervical plexus, the superior plexus and the inferior plexus. And the third. What about you, Peter?
Middle.
It's not the middle. It's another name for it.
Stellate.
Huh?
Stellate ganglion?
Stellate.
The middle ganglion. Yeah. It is the stellate. But there's a different. There's a name which indicates that it's the intermediate. You see.
I don't remember.
Anyway, well, it would be a very good idea sometime today to get your anatomy books out and to really take a good look at this whole bit, because the superior autonomic ganglion innervates the eyes, the ears, lots of stuff inside the head. By the time you get to that medial ganglion, you begin to get innervation going from above below. You begin to get strands that go down as far as the heart. And this is a very important control mechanism, or not control mechanism, but determining mechanism on the whole organization and control of the heart beat and its functions. And the lower ganglion does the same thing. It goes into the lungs as well. And then through the neck, very superficially, passes the great vagus nerve, which is a cranial nerve, not a cervical nerve. And it goes all the way down, sending strands to the heart in terms of regulating its mechanism, and more to the whole, to the gut as a whole. And on its well-being determines the balance that talks about what kind of digestive balance you can attain, digestive function. Because your digestive function, again, is a balance between nervous systems.
Sure, it's middle. Superior, middle, and inferior. I think it's just middle.
It's just middle. Okay. Anyway, all of this is determined in terms of that cervical structure, which at this point you had better take a good look at and deal with. What do they say?
There's a diagram there that's quite good.
Yeah, that is quite good. Superior, middle, and inferior. Oh, yes, so bright.
You said it first.
Yeah, who's keeping
Yeah,
track of the
that's a good one.
slides?
Well, we got it all written down.
Is that a Lang book, Mac?
Yeah, that's Unarm's. That's a good book.
Physiology?
Medical physiology.
That's the one I was telling you about. Yeah, that would be a good book for you.
Yeah. In fact, any of those Lang publications are really good synopsis for people who haven't been through medicine. They're really good on any subject.
Now, some of you have had your hands in your own necks and in other people's necks. And you have found that in too many necks you don't feel anything but this, quote, slick thump, which is really the wrapping of, the wrapping around the vertebral stem itself. And so you realize that when you get this kind of an abstraction of how these cervical ganglia lie, what you are really talking about is that those cervical ganglia have to lie on this slick connective tissue envelope that encases vertebrae. And that any distortion of the vertebra is going to show up a very marked influence on those ganglia and their functioning. People will often say to you, even after the first hour, "Oh, I see things I didn't see when I came in here. I can see that corner of the room clearly." Isn't that funny? You didn't do anything to my eyes. No, but you better have fixed those cervical ganglia or you haven't done your stuff. And you see then, therefore and then, this becomes one of the most important of the hours. I don't know, they're all important. There's a story about this hour that maybe you better hear, because from time to time myths arise. Now, all kinds of them around this town, as you very well know. And that myth concerns Fritz and me. And these are some of the facts of the case. I'm talking about Fritz Perls, of course. Fritz was in very great pain and very great misery with his anginal problems about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And very few times in the course of my experience with Fritz have I ever heard him say that he had gotten to the stage where he was willing to die. But he was willing to die at that point because he said the pain that he was in was more than he could handle. And at this stage, he gave a seminar down in Los Angeles in the home of the Sharpens in Laguna Beach. And it so happened that Dorothy Nolte was in that seminar, and she saw how miserable he was. And she went up to him at the end of one of the sessions, and she said, "Fritz, I'd like to take you upstairs, and I'd like to show you what we do," because she said, "I think it's important that you should know about it." And she took him upstairs, and she gave him a first hour. And she had the luck of the Irish. It worked. And it completely took that pain away. And Fritz was pain-free for some weeks. And Fritz, being Fritz, knew that he was now clear forever, and that it wasn't at all necessary that on his way back from Florida to where he was going, that he stopped in New York. Oh no, yeah, this was fixed now. So he got back, having bumped around in various airplanes, etc., for a while, and of course it wasn't fixed. And the pain returned, and then he wanted Dorothy to do another hour on him, and she said no, she wouldn't take the responsibility, which was proper because this girl has absolutely no license, and if he died under our hands, it really would have been a mess. But she says, if you can get Ida out here, I'll bet she can do something for you. And so they telephoned that night, or sometime soon, and asked me whether I would come out here and work with Fritz Perls. And I said yes, I'd come out here sometime when he was giving a seminar, because I'd never seen him work, and I wanted to know I wanted to see him at work. And so I arranged to come out at a seminar a couple of weeks hence, etc. And I got in, and Fritz was still in an utter misery, and I got in one Friday afternoon. And between that Friday afternoon and the following Friday afternoon, or Saturday afternoon, you see, 8 or 9 days, I gave Fritz 6 more hours of work, and Dorothy had given him his first. And sometimes the going was kind of rough. But at any rate, on the following Friday afternoon, or Saturday, it seems to me I remember I left that Saturday morning, so it must have been Friday afternoon, I gave him the 7th hour of work. And right under my hands, the man went unconscious. Needless to say, my knees were shaking. And I guess if anybody had been around, which they weren't, I'd have been looking pretty green. And I said to myself that I was a bloody fool to take on a man as badly off as this. And along about that moment, I stopped panicking and started looking. And I said, yeah, but this isn't the picture of a man in a heart attack, dying of a heart attack. This is a picture of a man under anesthesia. And so I kept my hands on his head and on his neck and waited for him to get out of it. And presently, after a matter of, I don't know, a minute, it was a week, I'm sure it was a week, he opened his eyes. And of course, I prayed to the good Lord that he wouldn't have known that he was unconscious. But the good Lord was out to lunch. And so, the first thing that Fritz said was, well, yes, they really gave me a hard time that time. And he proceeded to unravel an episode of surgery many years before, when he was certain that they had damaged his neck in the course of the anesthesia. And to those of you who over and over and over again come to me and say, why can't you use anesthesia in this work? Here is the answer. You will never do anything that's so bad without anesthesia that you will damage situations without their being in such misery that you quit. But under anesthesia, you can do all kinds of things. And when he came out of that anesthesia, he sent for the anesthetist, and he told him that he had caused damage to his neck. And of course, they insisted that there was no damage done. But you see, what had actually been done was that something had thoroughly disturbed this whole left chain of ganglia here, and that as and when it recovered, it did not go back where it belonged. And from that time on started, a little and a little, this deterioration which ended up in this heart condition. And from the day that my knees shook and he, quote, died, from that day he never had another intense anginal attack. He had a few that were relatively minor. And by, he settled down to having a heart that worked practically normally. And as you all know, he'd walk up from the baths to that house up there of his, which certainly gets me puffing, still does. And this was part of the cost for him. And what he was complaining about when he did it was not walking up that hill and what it did to his heart, but what it did to his legs. And he'd come in complaining about his legs and his legs and his legs and his legs. And little, he started getting over the leg business. But at any rate, this is the indication to you of the significance of these plexi. And I think that some of the cures that the cervical school of chiropractors credit to chiropractic are really not due to the cervical vertebra, the second and third cervical vertebra, as much as they're due to the replacement, you see, of this chain of autonomic plexi. The fact of the matter remains that as you do a proper job on the neck and the head and the organization of that top segment of the body, you get all kinds of very dramatic episodes coming in terms of hearing, in terms of sightedness, in terms of hay fever, in terms of 20-year-old sinuses and postnasal drips and that sort of thing, as well as in terms of asthma and emphysema, and all of these things you just almost put your finger on and turn around when you get into that neck structure, if you do a good job. So that you have here one of the most important hours as far as your affecting well-being is concerned. So, today we're going to have to start on Frank with this 7th hour. And inasmuch as he's a, quote, fresh guy anyway, we could expect to have a fresher guy around. I would suggest that at this moment, while we're waiting for him, this has been briefer than, well, it hasn't been briefer than usual because we haven't had the usual lineup. But let's get this lineup and let's look at people's heads. And you can look at the people's heads who aren't in the lineup. To say about the way, the road that we traveled to get to today's work, and to point out what we need to know to do today's work.
Okay. Where would you like for me to start? How bad would you like me to go?
What would you
Well,
like to say?
Don't start too recently. I mean, bridge the connections as you understand it. And I'd like it a little more live than that book of Easts or Fasts or whatever his name is. Fast, just so slow somehow.
Okay. The assumptions we're working on are that the body is segmented and it's plastic. It's fluid down to the cellular level, which means that we can change it. And it's segmented, which means that we can relate it to each other, the parts to each other. And the name of the work is called Structural Integration, and structure itself, the word structure itself, connotes that there is a relationship. So we're working with relationship. And the word integration connotes that we are working with relationships both intra-body and outside of the body, or the energy field inside the body's energy fields inside the body, and the energy field related to larger energy fields. So that's the basis on which we start. And in the first session, we sort of unwrap and balance what is brought to us, what the body brings to us. And this is a very superficial level unwrapping, and yet it's a very dramatic kind of an hour because there are many, many changes that are visible to the person being processed. And the first hour differs from the other hours in the sense that the first hour you are balancing what's already there. You're not putting in that much, or your emphasis is more on balancing what's available than putting in. The other 9 hours you are putting in.
No, the other 8 hours you're putting in.
The other 8 hours you're putting in. 9 or 10 you're coming back to balancing.
Yeah, to balancing, right.
So, during that first hour, you do several things for the man. You improve his oxygen exchange. You free his thorax so that he can get more fuel, or more fuel for his machine there to start working, so that it will have the circulation and the oxygen to establish the changes that you propose or permit. I guess the changes that you're allowing.
You're evoking.
Evoking, yeah, that's the word I'm looking for, so that it will have the substance to do it with. And in that first hour, very briefly and oversimplified, you're trying to take the thorax from being jammed down on the pelvis and take the legs from being jammed up in the pelvis. So you're trying to free the pelvis. The thing you're working toward in the first hour is the pelvic lift, so that he will get a little movement in his lumbars, so that he will feel his pelvis a freedom to start changing. And you pretty generally go over the entire body with the exception of the knees down. And when you look at a pre-2, it should be pretty obvious that there's been no work from the knees down. And so that's, the body sort of leads you to where it wants to be worked on next. And for me personally, this is the big change that I'm seeing in me between this 6 weeks and the last 6 weeks, is that now I'm beginning to see the body acting, where the other 6 weeks the recipe was trying to get up here. So the body is kind of asking.
That's the object of the exercise in this 6 weeks, in your second 6 weeks.
It's a very beautiful kind of a thing, too, and a completely different orientation. Because I'm traditionally a head man, I think. I'm going to try to put it up here and then go from there instead of...
Well, may I at this point make what seems to me to be a very pertinent comment. Bill has been a head man, and he's always, ever since I've known him, been able to give a talk like this and do it very well. And yet, somehow this morning, you have a feeling of solidity in the man that hasn't been there before. There is more of Bill in his voice and behind his voice. And it seems to me, though this I think is largely imagination, that what he's saying is more solid. I think this is imagination. I think it's just my hearing of a tone. But is there anybody who would sort of stand behind me and say, yeah, I see it too?
Yeah, I'm very impressed this morning with the voice and the centered feel.
Yeah, he sounds like so much more person.
Yeah.
Let me go on then.
Go on.
No, don't clap yet. Okay, so the second hour, we're trying to build in mobility in the sense that we're trying to establish some horizontal hinges. And we're looking at the ankle, and we're working from the knee down. And we work with the ankle through the attachments, or the other end of the ankle, through the knees and the muscles from the knee down, including all the muscles in the foot. And we notice when we're doing that, though, that the entire body is changing, that the height of the shoulders are changing, and oftentimes you see changes in the face as you're working around the ankle. And you see all kinds of changes in the circulation and the respiration and this sort of thing. Coming up to the third hour, we see that the man has, pre-third hour, that he is lengthened in the front. And in the second hour, we notice that he's lengthened in the back. And he has a squashed-in feeling on both sides as you observe the man. So the body is calling that you go there, and which is what you do. And so the third hour, you're lengthening the lateral sides of the body. And this can take you all the way up to the neck and down to the knee, depending upon the particular body you're working with. And you're separating, and you're getting the length by the, I think it's law 13.5 or something, that if you want to lengthen the muscle, you go across. So you're looking for length, so you obviously go across the muscle as you go up. After the third hour, and when he's had time to sit for a day or so, you look at him again, and his medial line is short, which shows up to me, first of all, in between the leg, but if you look at the man a little bit longer, you can, maybe again this is imagination, but you can sort of see the shortness even through this area, through the top of the head down. So you go to that area, and like the third hour, you're again looking for length, so you go across. And you start inside the legs, and you go up, and again the body is sort of, in the fourth hour rather, the body is almost dragging you. And you start at the peripheral, which is another principle. And it sort of pulls you up the adductors and pulls you into the rami. And then when you start at the rami and you get the grass listening around, it sort of pulls you around to the back, and you kind of sense you need to do something on the back, which you do. Hopefully you do. And then...
Well, what do you do on the back?
Well, again, you're trying to get length.
All right.
You're going...
Oh, you mean literally on the back. I thought you were talking about it's pulling you around to the back of the pelvis,
well,
which also you...
Yes, which... It seems even more, you don't stop at the back of the pelvis. It feels that you need to go
Well, this
up.
is true, but you see, you haven't stressed the fact that this fourth hour will pull you into the hamstrings.
It's the, right, it's the first hour you directly go into the pelvis.
Yes, we do in the
And
fourth hour.
if I remember correctly, I think last time you made a statement which hit me, because it was pretty pictorial, that this is a time, or the ramus is a time that you... What did you say? It's the harbor of the pelvis to the
Port of entry.
good tone or something.
I think she said port of entry.
The port of entry to the harbor of good tone. Right.
She's
That's
real
it.
bright, isn't she?
Yeah. It's the port of entry to the harbor of good tone. Yeah. And
I must meet that woman someday.
But wait a minute now.
it's the port of entry to the harbor of good tone.
But I didn't hear you stress, the reason I put my 2 cents in is because I didn't hear you remembering that that pelvis has to be organized from the ischia too,
Yes.
by way of the hamstrings.
Which is why you go down similar to the first hour.
That's right,
But
but deeper.
actually, it's different because you're concentrating on the ischia and you're doing different things. You're manipulating the ischia rather than just loosening them.
That's right, that's right.
And
you're probably separating on the ischia what is apt to be a bunch of hamstrings plus adductor magnus. You see, this is apt to be all run together. And what you're doing is isolating it so that you now have an adductor magnus and separate hamstrings.
I sort of see the 4th, 5th, and 6th hours as sort of putting the pelvis in the center of a spider web.
That's right.
And you're going around and you're releasing. You can't release everything, so you're releasing what you can, which leaves you something else, and you release something else. And then after a while, the center of the spider web is no longer bound up with all these strings.
That's right. That's right.
So
That's right.
the pre-5th hour picture is one that you would not be proud of after a first hour. If the man came out, they generally look worse then than they do at the first. They're pulled down, the thorax is pulled down, and you can see that something is happening on the front of the pelvis. So your intention is to go in there and free that particular part of the spider web and get all those cobwebs out of there, which is the rectus abdominis primarily. And you start by freeing it at the periphery, which is up here, the periphery away from the pelvis. And you go down that and free at the pubes, and then you go under and you're looking for the psoas. And you go in there, and sometimes you can only sort of tickle it, and that's a pretty big job for some people. And you notice that the lumbars go back more than they ever have before. And then the pre-6th hour, you look again, and you've gotten from the underside of the pelvis and from a back around the hamstrings, and you've gotten the front side of the pelvis, and there's still something obviously wrong with the thing. So you look to the rotators, and you, again, starting at the periphery, which can be the ankles, and coming up the front side of the shin, usually on the lateral side of the shin, there's some tie-ups with most people's legs, and you free going up and separating the hamstrings. And you're looking, the key to unlock the lock on this pelvis at this hour is the piriformis. And the reason that's so important is because it goes to or comes from the anterior part of the sacrum, which is the part we haven't been able to get to, and usually the part that the base is anterior and the apex is posterior, too much. And so you work in that area, and the key, the hallmark, that way you've done a pretty good job, is that the breathing starts, and when the breathing starts, you can see the pumping action of the pelvis when they're laying on their stomach. And oftentimes you have to go up to in the area of the rhomboids or in the lumbar thorax hinge area, because it may be held up there.
Yeah, hold on a minute, Bill. You haven't really stressed the fact that there are 3 times up to date when you have been able to take a look at the coccyx and perhaps do something about it. The 1st hour, the 4th hour, and the 6th hour. And if you haven't got it done by that time, in the first place, you're throwing rocks in your own way. And in the second place, there is no other logical place coming up where you can do this. But more than this, you are throwing rocks in your own path. Because if that coccyx is not able to swing itself, to hammock itself between those 2 ischiae, you can't get the kind of balance in a pelvis that you're looking for. And you saw on some of these people here where fairly good 4th hours had been done. So I'm done, for instance. Fairly good 4th hours had been done, but you weren't getting the response. And the reason you weren't getting the response was that coccyx had not been appropriately organized. And in addition to the sacrum being your target in the 4th hour, in the 6th hour, the coccyx and its relation to the sacrum and to the ischiae is an absolute must in that hour. We all still tend to think in terms of medicine, of the physiology, of the anatomy that we've been taught. But a coccyx isn't that important. You break a coccyx, all right, you have a bad time, quite some little time, but then it's over. And there's nothing we can do about it, says the medic. But you see, this is one of the basic premises that need to be changed. A coccyx is a very important, a very significant indicator of what's going on. And I called your attention the other day to the fact that one of the reasons why the coccyx is such an important indicator is because it gears into the nervous system by virtue of the placement of the ganglion of Limbaugh. Now, the coccyx is also this very important member of the body by virtue of the fact that it is the anchorage for the pubococcygeus. And if that coccyx is all askew, there is nothing which gives you an appropriately toned and an appropriately balanced floor of the pelvis. And you see, in the fourth hour, when you're dealing with the floor of the pelvis, you take a look at the coccyx. But in the sixth hour, when you're finishing your precise pelvic work, it better be good. You see, the pelvis is the important major goal that you're working with and for in all these earlier hours. But that coccyx is a vital part of the pelvis because it determines the floor. And in determining the floor, it determines to a large degree the general tone of the sympathetic nervous system. And I talked about this fairly briefly in terms of the old yogic principle of dilating the anus. And it is still a very satisfactory way of handling a great many situations that have to do with the nervous system. Insomnia for one, any sort of spasm of the intestinal tract for another. I quoted the kind of tension headaches that come at the end of a long day at the office, etc., etc. Now, you just put a rectal dilator in, and it's just unbelievable how the whole circulatory balance of that body changes. And the only way this can really be happening is through the levita anus, through the pubococcygeus, and through what is going on in terms of the nervous balance, the position of the level of which is determined by the position of the coccyx. Let's not forget about this. And let's get into a sort of reality about the fact that that there is little doubt in my mind that what these yoga people were talking about in terms of their lowest center is this nervous plexus that lies in this area. Now, I don't know, and I don't know anybody that does know. If I did, I'd take the time to go and find out from him about the relations of these centers to the actual anatomical, physical nervous plexus. And I'm sure that the only way any of these boys are going to know about it is through the kind of fifth hour, the voice within me says stuff. Casey said stuff, etc., etc. These are psychic methods. My job, I feel, is to take stuff out of that psychic realm and bridge it into a place where we have more demonstrable material in the three-dimensional physical world with which we can work to make better three-dimensional physical beings. And this psychic information, this fifth hour information, I do not feel is sufficiently verifiable, repeatable by many people to be useful at this particular time. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying they don't get insights. I'm not saying they don't get truth. I feel that everything that is known, everything that becomes known by the, quote, scientific method, long before it becomes known that way, is known intuitively by people who are endowed in that fifth hour area, that fifth level area. But I do not feel that that our culture at this time can profit that much by that kind of information, except as a sort of map toward which to go. To say, I know it there, I don't think we're entitled to do this at this point. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, I don't know. But at any rate, what I'm stressing here is the importance of that coccyx to your understanding of the body, to your establishment of good functioning of the body, and perhaps to your enlightenment concerning the relationship of functioning within the body. Perhaps. It depends on how much is in your particular mind. But don't forget that coccyx. Huh?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading in the book last night, the ganglion of Impar is the only unpaired ganglia in the whole chain, with the exception of the brainstem.
Right.
So that the brainstem and the Impar are kind of the ends of the...
I know.
Where they come
I'm awful
together.
glad you know, but where did you see it in print?
In that book I showed you yesterday.
You did. Get me a copy of the book.
That book that wasn't worth anything.
It isn't worth anything. I said it was too much of a specialist book. I didn't
Right.
say it wasn't worth
It has
it.
quite a long description of that ganglia in it.
Okay, let's copy the description. The information that I have about that ganglion of Impar never came out of a nice, respectable anatomy book. It came from Yoga medicine. And in Yoga medicine, down through the centuries, they've understood about that ganglion of Impar. And they've controlled such things as epileptic seizures through that ganglion of Impar. And I presume they were thinking in terms of centers rather than ganglia. But at any rate, it has been done. Okay, Bill.
Okay, just one thing I would like to add about hours 4, 5, and 6 is 1, 2, and 3 are sort of getting you ready to get in to the meaty part of the nut, I guess. And I see it sort of as a sine curve, and 4, 5, and 6 are right at the middle, right at the middle of the
I see what you're saying.
of the course,
That's
or
right.
the processing. And
Right.
it's either got, this is a high point and it's got to be done now or it won't be done.
That's
because
right.
from here on out, you're putting things together on the assumption that the pelvis is
That you've
where it
got
should be.
something to put together.
Right.
Yeah, right.
So to me, I can't see, I'm not saying they're the most important hours, but if they're
Well, just
not done
between,
right, they're,
between us gals, each one is important.
right.
Because each one, if you do not have it done, you cannot build on it. See, each one is a step that you're laying on top of the step below it. And if the step below it is out of line, not deep enough and so forth, you've got nothing on which to build.
4, 5, and 6 you can't go back to after you finish reading.
I don't know if you can go back to them or not. I don't think you can go forward from them until you're finished.
That's right.
Because you're not putting
Yeah.
together, you don't have anything to put stuff on.
Right.
That's right. And you see, this is the basic difference between what we are trying to convey in this classroom to each other and all the other more orthodox systems of teaching. So you've been through chiropractic, through osteopathy and so forth, where there is no sense of this fundamental progression which you have to understand and utilize to change an individual. They are repeating on the same thing. They are trying to fix something that has become unfixed. But this is not what we are talking about. You have to build step by step by step. You have to climb onto the next step in order to get to the following step. And you can't jump it. And this becomes your problem as you get out of this class and you start to work. You know it in your head, but somehow your hands have not gotten the rhythm. And then you get scared to death that, oh, I'm going to be And the fact of the matter is you haven't gone deep enough to clean off the steps so that you can really make it horizontal and lay something on it. It's full of accretions of garbage. And you can't balance the stuff on top of that heap of garbage, etc. So now you go from that ganglion of impar to the other ganglion at the other end of the line. Oh wait, there's something I want to say. Other than Fritz, is there anyone in this room who's ever heard of an osteopath whose name was Sutherland?
Yes.
You have?
You mentioned him last 6 weeks.
Anyway, yeah, I remember I did give a very extended discussion on this. Anyway, Sutherland was a man who was rather in the age group with old Dr. Still. No, he was young. He was middle-aged when Dr. Still was old. Dr. Still, the founder of osteopathy. And those two men were great friends. But Sutherland apparently was a pretty smart guy, and he went to various hidden sources. Dr. Still was a much more, what shall I say, a much less subtle guy than Sutherland. And Sutherland apparently went to the books of Swedenborg to get an understanding of human beings. And out of this study of his, which he has never acknowledged, he came up with the recognition of a different function of respiration. And this different function of respiration is important to you people. And he said that the primary mechanism of respiration was not the lungs, the ribs going in and out, and the lungs filling and emptying. He said this was a byproduct of respiration. He said that the primary function of respiration was a respiring within the spinal structure. He postulated that the cranium was in itself a movable and a pumping device, or part of the pumping device, and that there was a flow of the spinal fluid which was in response to that primary respiration, which is the primary respiration, according to Sutherland. And that this whole lung bit was just a nice little piece of velvet that's giving you an addition to take care of oxygen supply. But that the real vital movement of the body, life of the body, vitality of the body, was this movement of the spinal fluid through the spinal structure.
Speransky's.
Well, okay. I asked Dick last night to look for that book. If that's Speransky's thing, then I don't know Speransky's book. And as I say, it is my belief, and I don't really know Swedenborg that well, but it is my belief that this was advanced in some books of Swedenborg that he called the brain. And working on this premise, Sutherland started a group within the osteopaths who were known as the cranial osteopaths. And there are still some few of them around. It's not a growing movement. And they did some extremely interesting things by simply holding the head, not too tightly at that, and allowing the movement with this restricted head to change the spine. And as I say, they did some quite impressive things, especially in terms of spastic children. And they started a movement which should have had a great deal more publicity than it has ever had of taking a look at a child's head after birth. And simply by, it's really a quite gentle technique of allowing the child himself, you see, to change the relationship of the bones. And it does give children beautiful heads, very beautiful heads.
It's a very delicate balancing technique.
It's a very delicate balancing technique, and that school of the osteopaths knew a very great, had a much greater perception of the necessity of balance than the more cruder school.
Is it a movement? Is any movement with it?
Very gentle. The theory, as I understand it, is that in the cranium, actually parts of the cranium are more restricted in their motions than others. The temporal bone may be locked on one side, not the other. They feel they can delineate where which area of the cranium is restricted in its motion. And by just holding the head and balancing this bone, that's what I put it. We balance the two sides of the cranium, and at this time, major things happen.
And by doing it so
You've mentioned Swedenborg a couple times. Who and where was he?
You don't know about Swedenborg?
I've heard you mention his name numerous times, but I assume he was late 19th
Swedenborg
century.
is a man whose followers, as of right now, consider him literally on a par with Jesus Christ. He was a Swede who lived in the 18th century, that's right. To a great extent, he was a very practical man. He was a much more practical man than you expect of mystics. He held government jobs. If I remember, he held government jobs in mining. Anybody remember that? Anybody know about this? At any rate, he held very down-to-earth government regulatory jobs. And all of a sudden, the guy got a notion. I think this was a sequence. All of a sudden, the guy got a notion that he wanted to know more about human bodies. And he went from Sweden down into Italy. And he spent something like 2 years in Italy, just doing anatomy and dissection and one thing and another. And I think it was after that he had this tremendous psychic experience of entry into another world, which he could largely handle at will. And in being in the other world, as he felt it and expressed it, he brought through a very great deal of presumably data about what is the soul and how does it act, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And by this time, of course, everybody said, well, Swedenborg is crazy. And even today, if you are quoting Swedenborg, you will meet up with people who will say, oh, well, that insane individual, why consider him? But there is a very sizable community on the face of the earth today of the Swedenborgians. And in every major city, there is at least one Swedenborgian church. And as I say to you, the people who really take Swedenborg seriously feel that he is literally on a level with Jesus Christ.
There's a lot in San Francisco. A lot of Swedenborgians.
Yeah, and they have one of the sweetest little churches I've ever seen anywhere down near Redondo Beach. Oh, that is a lovely place. And there is a very going Swedenborgian society. I say it's very going. I must admit it sometimes goes very slowly. Who are custodians of the material that Swedenborg brought through and are responsible for reprinting this sort of thing. And some of the kind of Swedenborgian material which would be of interest to you people, that is material that has to do with human bodies, and there's a vast material there. This is complicated by the problems of who it was that did the translation. And you see, when it was a clergyman who was translating anatomy, the translation is frequently not that clear. But Borica, if I remember rightly, Borica, the homeopath, the man who founded Borica and Tafels, was really a very well informed medic.
How do you spell that name?
Boerice. He made a translation which is pretty hard to get. And there are books that are, the titles of which are The Animal Kingdom and The Economy of the Animal Kingdom. And those are not the same books. The economy is not the animal kingdom. And then there are these books, the brain. Now the brain is an impossible thing to get a hold of. Originally there were 6 copies, or was it 4, printed, and that's all. And old what's-his-name had one of those. Sutherland had one of those. And when somebody accused him or suggested to him that, oh, I see where you got some of your ideas, that book disappeared. It hasn't reappeared. Even after his death, it hasn't reappeared.
You took it with him?
He took it with him.
You bet. It's spelled Boerick?
Yeah, don't you know how Boric and Taffel? Oh my goodness, some of you medics are so dumb. Boric and Taffel were a pair of well-qualified physicians, qualified in the conventional school, then became homeopaths, and they set up one of the 2 very large homeopathic supply outfits in this country. And they used the home base was in Philadelphia, and they had an outlet in New York, and by and by, as homeopathy shut down more and more, the New York place was shut down, and they now are still operational in Philadelphia. And Boric collected some very good homeopathic materia medicus. I mean, in terms of homeopathy, Boric is way up at the top of the list. Who Mr. Taffel was, I never did hear. Boric is now dead, of course, and Taffel probably is too. There's a very big homeopathic supply house in Chicago, whose name at the moment I don't recall. Anyway. So now, you see, this consideration belongs between the 6th hour and the 7th hour. Because what you see in that pumping of the sacrum is what Mr. Sutherland was talking about, I think. But Mr. Sutherland did not know how to induce it in this fashion. And you see what that really does is literally establish a polarity between the cranium and the coccyx. A polarity in which there is a spanning, and the tone of the spanning has a rhythm, and that this is the vital mechanism within a man. This is a vital mechanism within a man. Now, as you all know, in most men, this does not work. And what happens there and then, I don't know. They're not all dead. They're not all zombies. Many of them are out in the wide, wide world working like troopers. And it's not an all or nothing situation. But it has to be that if you establish this other polarity, you are getting a new dimension added to the operation of the man. I don't see how it's possible not to assume this. And no matter how you slice it, you can't talk about that dimension in terms of blood circulation, for instance. You can't simplify it. Something is changing. Something is going on. And then you see, you are getting a different speed of rhythm, which is geared in with the heart and the lung rhythm, that's going all the way through that individual. And if you begin to look at the people around you who have been processed, versus the people around you who have not been processed, and even how they sit in their chairs and so forth, you begin to become aware of the fact that a man is not a blob, but that he is a something within which there is this everlasting movement. And then you see, having started to establish this down at the bottom, then you go up to do that 7th hour work. And your 7th hour starts, like all 7th hours, at the periphery. It starts at the periphery of the cranium, at the neck, the splenius, the sternocleidomastoid, the trapezius, the what have you, the outside working in. And you free these muscles much more than they have been freed. And you have to remember that those muscles attach down as far as the 2nd rib, that those muscles are interfered with when the clavicle is glued onto the 1st rib, that this has to be organized in order to permit that cranium to set itself squarely within the shoulder yoke. Because the old anatomists called that shoulder girdle a yoke, and why they were so smart, I don't know. But on the other hand, Mr. James was in here yesterday, as you know, and you could all see a yoke on that man. And what I'm saying to you people is that these people who were brought up in the relatively simple nutritional patterns that were prevalent in outlying districts throughout Europe showed up different patternings that have been destroyed by our different type of nutritional organization. And I was amazed to see that man, whom I know, because I had my hands on him, I know what amount of trouble that guy was in when he came to us. He was literally made of he was an iron man. And yet here, 7 hours after, you see the basic pattern all out there, all screaming to be given that proper job to do. And we must get a hold of those basic, and publish within our own group, that basic book of Western prices with those pictures. We must. Because it is urgently important that you people see this. Okay. So as I say, you get a hold of that head, and everything that you are doing in that head is enabling you to relate that head to 3-space, to get those eyes looking out on a horizontal, to see a horizontal line of the mouth, to see a 3-dimensional organization of that head. Because just as the pelvis is the key to the vital being of that body, so the positioning of this tremendous nervous plexus that is within the head is the key to the behavior. The behavior is dependent on nervous tissue in the body. And you see, the stuff that is within that cranium is a hydrostatic equilibrium, is in a hydrostatic equilibrium. This is really a fluid material, as you all know. And if you're tipping that head up this way, you're going to get different pressures on different centers than if you're tipping your head this way, or not tipping your head this way. If your head is consistently over to one side, you're going to get different relationships between the fourth ventricle, for instance, and its surrounding structures. Or you name it, and you see that it's so. You know, Don, when it comes right down to it, the other end of that line, there's got to be the pituitary or the pineal. I mean, that's the single thing.
Yeah, I guess it's the pituitary and the pituitary axis, and the part of the hypothalamus that feeds the pituitary.
Yeah, but you see, those are the only single things. Where you come to the cerebral lobes, you have the duplicate there.
Yeah, it would have to be the brain stem.
It's got to be,
in the middle. There isn't any direct nervous communication to the pituitary. It's all chemical mediated.
Yeah.
So it would have to be in the hypothalamus, directly above the pituitary, I would think, would be the correspondent to the impart. The pineal, I don't know much about.
Neither does anybody else that I've ever been able to find out about. I'd certainly like to see or find out a little about it. Let's try
I'll see if it's in my book.
There's an interesting book by Gellhorn on somatic autonomic integration of the hypothalamus in particular. He's unfortunately never explored the impar ganglion or any of the other ganglion for that matter. But he's written an entire book, 2 books, on just this problem of somatic autonomic balance in the hypothalamus. What's the name? Gellhorn. It's called, I think, somatic autonomic balance.
There's one problem about knowing too much. And that is that you break down your overall passioning into details. And you get the notion that, oh, I'm going after the hypothalamus or something like this. And just as soon as you do that, you've lost your touch. And I warn you all, it is the whole tendency of our age, and it is the reason why we're in trouble in terms of health understandings now. Because we have broken these down into 2 small parts. And we cannot see the whole because we keep looking at the trees. We can't see the forest. And don't get the notion that because you know a very great many details that you have the capacity in your hand for remedying. Because you've all seen what happens here when you can handle the overall pattern. It's such a, to me too, it's such a temptation to get myself enamored, be glamored of these sweet little byways out into the woods. Here's this kind of a tree, and here's that kind of a tree, and here's the other kind of a tree. But the thing that you have to do if you are trying to do the kind of work that we've established here is to resist temptation. It's hard to do.
Yes, that's true, because you start with something that works, and then all of a sudden
and you thin it down, and presently
you're
it's
right
so
back
thin.
to where the mainstream of
That's
science
right.
is and getting
That's
nowhere.
right, and getting nowhere. And this is the reason why you guys have to stick together in order to keep a climate of thinking in terms of wholes and not pieces. It's going to be a tough road you're going to travel, but some of you will be able to make that bridge, I'm absolutely sure. Well, getting back to that 7th hour. It doesn't seem to have occurred to anybody except to the cranial osteopaths, and not very much to them, that the literal free-space balance of the head depended and depends on muscles that are inside the head as well as outside the head. This never occurred to them. It never occurred to them that in terms of the physical carriage of the body, the individual who carries his head forward in order to balance the imbalance that is below, as for instance Jerry over here, will have managed to get himself the kind of muscular imbalance inside of his head, which has many significances. The whole tongue will have moved forward. And in that the tongue as a whole and the whole tongue has moved forward, you now have all kinds of pressures into the sixth cervical. You also have all kinds of interferences with the well-being of the thyroid and the parathyroid and the thymus, etc., etc. But one of the reasons why that anterior sixth cervical has always been the major boogaboo to osteopaths and to chiropractors has been that they haven't understood that they can't get a sixth cervical back until they let this stuff come back. And this stuff is the stuff that lies under the chin. In front, it is all the prevertebral soft tissue. And in order to organize the cervicals, you have got to organize that soft tissue. And so you go into the mouth. Therefore, you have to go into the mouth. Now, the smarter you are with your preparation, the less necessity there is to go into the mouth. But there is a certain amount of necessity, no matter how smart you are. But I call to your attention, especially those of you that do not play around, protected by MDs, that you are much better off if you can work on the, legally, you are in a much stronger position as you get more experience handling this tissue from the outside. It's the same sort of stuff we were talking about in terms of vaginal and rectal techniques. Once you are inside that body, you are in dangerous territory, and it may blow up on you any time. Do not ever, under any circumstances, go into the mouth of anybody whose emotional stability you doubt. Because you don't know what you're talking, what you're touching. You don't know how emotion charged those areas are, and they're not telling you at this particular point. Supposing this whole situation is literally a shut-up box of emotion that has to do with birth and very early nursing experiences of childhood and so forth. And you get into that after you have known this man or woman only for 6 hours. And the thing blows right up in your face. It'll blow up in your face if you've been handling that neck on the outside. But it can blow up into your face if you're handling that neck on the inside. And they can swear by all that's holy that you have damaged them forever. And there's nobody to disprove it. Because nobody knows, except you, and you're the one that's now the defendant. So be careful with this technique. There's a good reason why some of these people avoid this 7th hour stuff. And yet, unless you get that head where it's going, you haven't done what you can do. But just remember that you do not have to give salvation to every human being that walks the earth. Your job is to make them walk a little more comfortably. And their salvation has to come from some other sources. So you go in there finding out for yourself, perhaps, that the positioning of the tongue determines where your 2nd and 3rd cervicals are going to be and where your 6th cervical is going to be.
What happens when you tell this to chiropractors in the past? Did you get any
What happens when I what?
When you explain this to chiropractors.
I don't explain it. That's what you're paying money here for, to hear what I think about this.
I didn't know you were doing
A certain number of chiropractors have been in my class, of course, but they're not, average. Any chiropractor, if he opens his eyes and his mind, can understand, however, that he can give better cervical adjustments if the pelvis is turned under. I mean, this is so utterly obvious under your hands. But this whole head trip, in a different sense of head trip, is not a something that, you see, except you have the background of understanding of structure. What are you trying to do in the structuring of a body? It doesn't really have meaning to you. And one of the things that you have to learn, and it takes a hell of a lot of discipline to learn it, is to learn not to teach people, or not to try to teach people who aren't ready to hear, who haven't got the basic fundamental understanding to put what you're saying in its right perspective. You must learn to shut up. It's the toughest thing you ever learn. Now, when you get to the hard palate, you are no longer dealing with those cervicals. Then you're dealing with the relation between frontal and temporal and sphenoids, etc., etc. And all of these bones are related through elastic connective tissue. So there is no earthly reason why they can't be eased, if you're smart enough, into areas that are easier. Now, all of you have seen those faces change. And I'm certain that no one in this room would get up and argue that a skull can't change, or parts of it can't change in relation to other parts. You've seen it. The sphenoid is particularly vulnerable to emotional as well as physical trauma. A person who has suffered a very deep emotional grief will very often just have that sphenoid drop back, and their eyes seem to be so deep in their heads. And lo and behold, after you've given this sudden power, or even before, those eyes start coming out, and they start looking at the world again and being in the world again. Whereas after this terrific emotional grief, which may last for years as a matter of fact, they are just deep inside them and they can't make the contact. And along about that time, the neighbors begin really owing and awing, because Mrs. So-and-so not only looks so different, but Mrs. So-and-so picks up a telephone and chit-chats with her neighbors. And nobody's seen her do this since her daughter died 5 years ago, etc. And along about that time, you begin to understand something else about grief, as you begin to understand about other emotions. That grief certainly is an emotion, but that, like all emotions, it has this physical component. It moves flesh. It moves bones. Grief moves it by pulling out stability. You're just so shook up that nothing is stable anymore, and it's not stable chemically either. And then as you begin really getting this head in order, you begin to find out that heads are different things. They're not chunks of bone. They do not feel like stone. Bone does not feel like stone. Bone is a living substance, and it's an energized substance, and it's a vital substance. And either that head that you're working on feels as though it were living, and you can feel that it is a cellular spongy material, not a soft sponge, a structured sponge, or else you haven't done your job. You can go down the line in a school system, for instance, where you have kids in the class all lined up. And you can go down the line and apparently caress the children, by putting your hand on their head. And you can know every one of those kids that's in trouble or that's going to be in trouble by tomorrow. The kid that's going to be down with measles tomorrow. You can feel it in the head. Because the head is now burning, and it'll be burning before they really come down sick. And the kid whose head feels like stone, and there are plenty of them, is the kid that's been taken to every doctor in the town with some mysterious illness. And every doctor in the town says, well, I can't find anything. But Mama says she doesn't act like a child of her age should act. And all you have to do is to change that stone, all you have to do is to change that stone to bone, and the kid changes. It comes along. And it's a recipe that works, and it works every time. And you can feel the circulatory currents that are within that head. And if you can't, you haven't done your job. Because by the time you are able to do this job, you are able to do this feeling. There's no question about it. The changes that have been made in you as you are prepared to become practitioners. See, this is why I feel that this can never be that widespread a healing cult, because you can only change a limited number of people to become practitioners. You can't go out and teach 100 people in a class. And until these people have their own level of being at an appropriate height, they cannot produce the change necessary. So, at the end of that 7th hour, these people should be energizing themselves and their immediate environment differently. And this you have not only heard, but this you have seen. Amen, amen. Let's have some coffee.
Right. Can I record something?
Sure.
Thanks to your great time yesterday, I couldn't eat last night. I started eating, I kept dropping food all over myself.
Well, if you just get your head up. I'll see if that shuts you
No
off.
wonder you can't tighten up your mouth and just keep it
Remote around now, I had stuff all over the floor. I just dropping food everywhere.
up. And you can't see it.
Well, at any rate, you're out camping at posts, and there are always plenty of squirrels around. Not worried. At any rate, we're coming to hour 8 this morning.
Right. Can I record something?
Sure.
Thanks to your great time yesterday, I couldn't eat last night. I started eating, I kept dropping food all over myself.
Well, if you just get your head up. I'll see, that shuts you
No
up.
wonder you can't find your mouse. You just
They're running around now and stuff all over the floor. Like just drop the food everywhere.
and you can't see it.
Well, at any rate, you're out camping at posts, and there are always plenty of squirrels around. Not worried. At any rate, we're coming to hour 8 this morning. How did we get there, Fritz, and how do we look at this? And does anybody see any improvement in Dale? No, I don't. You do?
Got his leg all screwed up. That's a little better.
Yeah. He's braver.
He's braver. You see, when you're as tall as Dale, you have an everlasting problem that no amount of structural integration is going to really wipe out. What do you do with your legs when you sit on a chair that isn't high enough? What do you do with yourself when you lie in a bed that isn't long enough? There isn't a piece of furniture that really fits that man's body, and always he's got to do something with himself. So what he does, and what Eddie Jehaver does, is to wrap their feet around, their left foot around their right foot, or their feet around the legs of the chair, or something, or something, or something. They have a problem that's with them 24 hours a day and doesn't let up. If they are at home in a bed which has been picked out in terms of their height, they're reasonably well off. If they are at home where they have a chair which is reasonably appropriate to their height, they're fairly well off. Years ago, I inherited a very lovely stationary rocker from an old aunt of mine, breakup of her home. And I took this rocker, which was really a beautiful old antique piece, and I gave it to one of my sons, who is built like Dale, not quite as tall and not quite as wide, but nevertheless one of these long-legged guys. His waist comes up to here on me. Now, when the two of us sit at a table together, we're about the same height. But you see, he is long-legged like so many of that generation are. And I gave him this chair, and I said, here, Alan, don't let anybody get this chair away from you, because this is a chair in which you can sit and relax, because you tip it back, and it gives you the length necessary between your knee and your ankle. But you see, when Dale is set on a chair like that, this doesn't accommodate itself to him. And so forth and so forth. Now, in this day and age, you find a very great many instances of this problem. And understand that these guys have a problem, and that it's all very well for you to scream at them. But there are other things that are screaming at them so many more hours a day than you can get to them, that you have to expect that they're going to do the best they can to adjust themselves to make themselves more comfortable. And this makes a major problem out of it.
Automobiles are a big problem.
Automobiles are another one of
I
them.
see a lot of people who complain about their backs and necks and everything because of the fact they're in.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
And most of the better pickups rather than automobiles. People have two cars, they all prefer driving pickups.
I got into a lot of trouble with a guy once, because when he came into the class, he could just borrow his wife's car. He could just get into it. And when he left the class, he was so tall that he couldn't borrow his wife's car, and he couldn't get into it. So my name was Mud for a while. But at any rate, as I say, realize the problem that these people have, because it is something that is with you forever if you go into this line of effort. It isn't often, however, they complain about spilling the food on the floor. So at any rate, Fritz, what have you to say about it?
I just flashed on, you were talking before, again, in the structural integration, in a sense, in a very broad sense. The first 7 hours could be considered dealing with the structure, even though at the end of each hour there is a certain amount of balancing and organization. And the latter 3 hours are devoted to the integration.
That's right. You didn't have a flash. You heard that last session, last 7 hours. Yes, I made that point very loud and very clear, that now you have done all the taking apart has been done. And you have to go into a different phase of the work.
seems now that the horizontal and vertical lines of the body become more important than they have until now.
That's right.
And this is not only in terms of the stance and the movement of the body generally, but in each joint is moving in terms of a horizontal and vertical plane. And I think this is the emphasis of the latter portion of this, is to deal with larger segments of the body, to try to establish, again, the horizontal and vertical plane, and the three planes around the vertical line.
I still think that it would be a very good idea to go back, let's say, as far as the 6th hour, to make it more apparent as to how you pull this together. What was the work of the 6th hour?
The 6th hour is dealing with, ultimately, the sacrum and trying to, or accomplishing this floating of the sacrum. So the lumbar vertebra can become more, as lumbar vertebra become more posterior and flatter, the sacrum, in helping, the tip turns further under. It starts to float and move, which is the major.
Well, I like your description of float. However, whether it turns under or it doesn't turn under is a question of where it has to go in terms of the balance. So many of these sacrums that have these, to which are attached these cocci that have been turned way under, those sacrums don't need to be turned under.
Right.
They have to come to a different position with the coccyx.
The sacrum becomes oriented to the rest of the spine in terms of the respiratory movement.
Now, wait a minute. It does, but you're taking the wrong end of the stick. The sacrum becomes oriented to the pelvis. The sacrum participates in a more appropriate orientation of the pelvis. And you remember we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about the urgent importance of the coccyx in this project. And we spent a lot of time discussing the fact that the sacrum, that the coccyx, the position of the coccyx, the relation of the coccyx to the sacrum, all of this determines the floor of the pelvis, determines the adequacy of the relation of the nervous plexi that control the metabolism through that pelvis. We also discussed fairly at length the autonomic nervous system, and the fact that the lowest plexus there is a single plexus, the ganglion of Impar, and that ganglion lies in a place which is quite vulnerable, you see. All through your life, you are subject to falling on your little tail end. It's quite vulnerable. And if you expect to know how to organize the body, you have to be very well aware of the problem of the coccyx, the role of the ganglion, and you have to be alert for the role that the ganglion may be playing in the symptoms that this individual presents. And these symptoms may be anything, including heart disease. Because the ganglion of Impar is not merely an autonomic center, but also receives strands from the central nervous system and is unitary, that is, it's not a twin center. so that if something goes wrong with it, there's no other structure which is going to take on its job. And as you all know, bodies in general are created with duplicate parts that can take over when something gets injured. Now, what happens to that ganglion when they cut off the coccyx? I don't know that I know. Do you?
I don't think that they remove any ganglia. They remove the coccyx.
They certainly don't try to remove it, but you see, it now has no span support. And as many of you here know, the person injures a coccyx and is complaining of coccydynia, continuous pain of the coccyx, continuous pain sitting and so forth. There is no appropriate therapy for it available except to remove the offending bone, which is the world's silliest way of dealing with it. It's just about as silly as taking off a bunion by taking a slice off the bone instead of turning the bone around to where it was before it turned around to form the bunion. This is so silly, there's no use talking about it. But you see, I want to know that very clearly in your mind you have this picture of you are now taking care of one end of that polarity, which you're going up and take care of the other end in the 7th hour. Now, Fritz, what you were talking to me about, this respiratory movement stuff, it is so, but it's on a more superficial level than, I mean, if you think no deeper than that level, you're not thinking down to the level where I would like to know that you are conscious of the fact that you are establishing a polarity between two ends of a field. And you are. This is literally so. And when you have established that respiratory pattern, then what is going on is that you are establishing the span. And through the breathing, over and over again, you are doing this automatic spanning and changing and shifting and reorganizing the sacrum on the lumbars, and thereby allowing the lumbars to come back. Now you see, not until you get those lumbars back, and the position of the sacrum is going to determine that, but also the position and the freedom and the organization of the psoas is going to determine that. Also, the organization of the antagonist of the psoas, the rectus, is going to determine that. And you see now what we're doing, we're backing right down the line and showing you what it was, what were the steps on which you had to stand and climb in order to get where you are. So that by the end of the 6th hour, all of these things should be approximately established, so that the lumbars come back, so that the lumbars are able to have the degree of movement which lumbars are expected to have. You all remember Sharon's lumbars when she came in here, and yet Sharon had had 10 hours, but there was no movement in those lumbars. And I'm not throwing rotten eggs at the processor. It may have been a problem which was too complicated to get done in 10 hours. But in general, this isn't so, unless a man is really in trouble like Frank here. That certainly isn't going to be done in 10 hours. But a healthy young woman, even though she has had an accident, shouldn't have a lumbar that can't be reorganized. Now, only when you get that lumbar back where it belongs, with the degree of mobility that it should have, with the energy which depends on a proper chemical quality of the discs, the lumbar discs, only then are you going to be able to get up there and really reorganize the neck. And you see, nowhere along this whole system has there been an arbitrary decision. The whole thing is, if you like to call it that, a logical progression. But basically, it's much more important than a logical progression. It is a progression which you have seen the necessity for as those bodies stood up there. And one step after the other has screamed for help.
It's a progression of relationships.
That's right.
That word.
It's a progression of relationships. But I like to be very sure that the emphasis is in your mind, that in spite of all the yak-yakking and the thousands and the tens of thousands of words that have been battered back and forth between us in an effort to get us seeing the same thing at the same time, that nevertheless it has nothing to do with words. It has nothing to do with logic. It has to do with that thing that's been standing in the middle of this room, a living human being. And what that living human being calls for in terms of its necessities to take another step up. And it's written on every body that you have seen. And it will be written on every body that you will ever see. What do I have to do next? And it doesn't always tell you what you have to do next, but it does always tell you what you have to accomplish next. And the hump that's in the middle of the back may be what you have to accomplish next, but it doesn't tell you as loud and as clear that the hump in the back may come from some shortened hamstrings or something like that, you see. Right here, you have to begin to sharpen your own eyes. So that I want you, as I say, to recognize the way in which we have, through the logic of the body, not through the logic of the words, come to the place where now we have to take heed of the other end of the nervous chain, the big end of the nervous chain. And we have to see to it that we supply for that nervous structure there optimal conditions. And my definition of optimal conditions is defined in terms of your horizontals and verticals. What else can you use? And very oddly, intuitively, we know this. And intuitively, when we see a picture that talks about the kind of change that Bob's driver demonstrated yesterday, intuitively we know this is right. And nobody could persuade us that the after picture should have gone to the before picture rather than the before picture going to the after picture. You'd fight that to the last breath in your body. You'd say, I know this is so. Good God, man, can't you see it? Of course you can see it. But the fact is that, of course, practically anybody will see it. And anybody will concede that this has to be the place. And some of them will say, because it is beautiful. And this is a very interesting understanding, too, that we see as beautiful that which is functional. There's certain other qualities in beauty, too, but yet a real obvious precision of functioning we see as beautiful. And the airplane hostesses don't look that beautiful anymore. But then you see, in that 7th hour, you are enabled to get the head up and back and horizontal. When you get to the point where you look straight out of your eyes, as Bill Williams is doing right now, you will, and he's the only one in the room that really is too. Don's not doing badly. Or look around at these eyes. When you get to that point, automatically you get better vision. Unless you're always wearing the kind of glasses which then anchor you back in your aberration. Because eyes apparently are also made to perform best when they relate to the horizontal. When they are balanced. When they are balanced in terms of the depth of them, which anatomically speaking is that the sphenoid bone must be the same depth on each side. And you saw what variations you get in that. And the picture of Bob Driver yesterday comes particularly to mind. When we started, that sphenoid of his was cockeyed. The relation of emotion to this sort of thing. I called your attention to this yesterday. The relation of emotion to displacement in the cranial bones. The head bones rather than the cranial bones. And the fashion in which you can organize, to a degree, emotional instability through your organization of that whole head. Now don't press this too far. There is a place where you can reach into the physical body and affect the emotions. But don't just think that you press the button and this happens, or you press that button and this happens. God didn't make it so simple. Maybe someday we'll discover enough other things to make it more simple. Some of this cranial bone patterning must needs happen by virtue of loss of tone in a local area resulting from accident or disease processes. As, for instance, Bob Driver and that funny white eyelid that he had. But you see, now you are getting to a stage where you look with a much greater precision at the little things that are turning up. And you not only look at them with precision, but you automatically take to fitting them into the picture, into the puzzle, and getting an answer as to what the picture that's depicted on the puzzle is about. Now you see, it might, I don't know, it might in theory be possible to get a head where you had just the head structure more or less horizontal and the head was free. I don't think this is possible, but it's conceivable. But you see, if you did that, you do not get the relation between these two ends of this field. You must have your horizontal head, and it must be lifted up to the place where you get appropriate and symmetrical spanning. And this calls for the connection through the neck, you see, being appropriate. Now, some of you yesterday did some palpating on necks. Who was it?
I did.
When I said to you, put your hand here and feel what happens as you get the equivalent of a head going up. Of course, it was on the floor, so the head was being extended horizontally. Get the feeling of what happens in terms of the neck muscles When you say to a guy, get the top of your head up, and he does get the top of his head up. And then get the converse of this, the recognition of what happens to the guy after you have given him his 7th hour, and you can't get through his thick skull that he has to get his head up if he's going to keep it. And there are lots of them. Some of them in this room. I've had my 7th hour. Yeah, he's had his 7th hour, but he has not grasped the good that the 7th hour was designed to give him. He's just let it slip down the drain. And Fritz, I hate to tell you this, but I am talking to you at this point. Get the top of your head up. And as you do it, either feel with your awareness or feel with your fingers what's going on in your neck. Now, I know perfectly well that I'm talking as though this were a simple matter of voluntary will. It's not a simple matter. It is a matter of voluntary will for a while. But you see, as those muscles get to the point where they are balancing, when you use the right side, you are using the left, etc., etc., that's the time when you reestablish his cervical pattern. That's the time when it gets in there so that it doesn't get out of there. Now, some of you around here, I know, have been in anatomical museums, and you've looked at the inside of skulls, and you have seen that the inside of skulls are not necessarily symmetrical. They're asymmetrical more often, perhaps, than they're symmetrical. I remember my amazement when I first saw this, when I first saw a skull lying in its case, and I looked at it and I said, but look, this is all crooked. And as I threaded this whole thing out, I realized that I must needs be looking at the skull of a curvature or scoliotic. Now you're never going to really balance this kind of a head, but you sure can get an awful lot closer to it. And those of you that saw Eric and what happened to Eric last time have seen that what I said